Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Great Pacific War by Hector C. Bywater. Chapter 3, March, 1931.
It is clear from the private letters of Rear Admiral Ribley, made public after his death, that he fully recognized the desperate situation in which his squadron would be placed if it had to await attack by the Japanese fleet. In a letter dated March 8, 1931, he wrote, "I have been ordered to concentrate at Manila to assist the land defenses in repelling the Japanese invasion, which is momentarily expected. We have had no news from home since yesterday, as all radio messages taken in are incoherent and unreadable, and the cable went out of business last night. Consequently, we do not know if war has been declared. But apart from this interference with our communications, which can only be the work of the Japanese, there is something in the air which tells us the fight is about to begin. Of course, with our handful of old ships, we cannot do much against Japanese dreadnoughts, but we shall sell our lives dearly. I do not take my orders to mean that I am to remain in Manila Bay itself. That would be to repeat the suicidal blunder of the Spaniards in 1898. So the whole squadron is to leave as soon as we have coaled, which I expect will be about noon tomorrow. I shall then cruise off the coast and await developments. Our aircraft should give us early warning of the enemy's approach. If he is accompanied by troop transports, we shall try and sink as many of these as we possibly can before going under. But I am afraid he will not bring troops along until he has disposed of our squadron. If only we had a couple of fast, well-armed ships, we might make a fight for it. But as things are, we are in a tight corner. But at any rate, we will keep the flag flying to the last. In modern naval warfare, there is not much room for the fighting chance, which in former days sometimes enabled brave men to win victory in the teeth of fearful odds. The fleet which has the best ships and the heaviest guns is practically certain to win once battle has been joined, provided its officers and men are up to the average standard of efficiency. Courage of the highest order, dauntless resolution, superlative seamanship, all these qualities count for little against a crushing preponderance of material. It should therefore have been obvious to Admiral Morrison, the Chief of Naval Operations, that in ordering the Asiatic fleet to remain in the Philippines, he was dooming it to destruction. As we now know, a belief was cherished in Washington that, as at Chimolpo in 1904, the Japanese would make a combined naval and military attack on the islands, in which case they would have to bring crowded transports with the fleet. If that were done, the American squadron, small though it was, might be able to inflict sufficient damage to compensate for its own destruction. But this theory of a combined attack postulated a very imperfect knowledge of the laws of strategy on the part of the Japanese. In all their previous campaigns, they had shown themselves well acquainted with those laws, and there was no reason to suppose they would ignore them now. If they did attempt to throw troops ashore in the Philippines before the American squadron had been disposed of, it could only be because they feared the arrival of reinforcements from the United States, and wished to make themselves masters of the islands before these could come on the scene. But in fact, there was no such imperative need for haste. At least 3 weeks must elapse ere a large American fleet, attended by its slow fuel ships and other essential auxiliaries, could cross the Pacific even if it steamed all the way at its highest collective speed and was not molested en route. But although they doubted whether the American battle fleet would be dispatched to Asiatic waters, the Japanese had made all preparations to receive it, and could count with confidence on delaying its arrival until they had worked their will in the Philippines. So when Vice Admiral Hiraga steamed south to settle accounts with the American Asiatic fleet, he took no military transports with him. His force consisted of 3 battle cruisers, Congo, flagship Hiei and Kirishima, 6 light cruisers, 24 destroyers, and the airplane carrier Hosho. The speed of the slowest ship was 25 knots. The disparity between this fleet and the American squadron was immense. Admiral Ribley's 2 armored cruisers had a nominal speed of 22 knots, but so long as the squadron kept together, its pace must be regulated by that of the slowest unit, and the three old cruisers of the Denver class were not good for more than 15 knots. In gunpowder, the Japanese superiority was overwhelming. Counting only heavy pieces, they had 24 14-inch guns, which could range up to 24,000 yards, to which the Americans could oppose but 4 10-inch and 4 8-inch guns, whose extreme range was 15,000 yards. As the three old Denver cruisers simply did not count as fighting units, the only other vessels that could play any useful role in action were the 10 destroyers, 3 light mine layers, and 12 submarines. There was also the airplane carrier Curtis, a 22-knot ship which carried 14 planes, 6 of which were equipped for torpedo attack. Had Admiral Ribley chosen to remain inside Manila Bay, he would probably have been safe for the time being. For the Japanese, knowing 12-inch guns to be mounted in the batteries of Corregidor, which guard the entrance, would have hesitated to send in their big ships. But if the squadron stayed at Manila, there was very little chance of its ever coming out again, as the enemy would be sure to seal the channel with mines laid by submarines, besides keeping a strong blockading force near at hand. And with the American squadron safely bottled up, there would be nothing to stop the Japanese transports from putting to sea. The investment of Port Arthur in 1904 had provided ample warning of what would follow. Landing, as it was expected to do, at points on the coast of Luzon, well away from the batteries at Manila, the invading army would advance towards that city and bring the bay under artillery fire, making it a death trap for the American ships. As the garrison of Luzon, including native troops, did not exceed 17,000 men, they could not hope to fight more than a delaying action against an army of 80,000, which was the minimum number the Japanese were expected to send. When all these facts are given due weight, Admiral Ribley's decision to meet the enemy outside Manila is seen to have been the soundest one that was possible under the circumstances. So long as his ships remained above water, they constituted a fleet in being, and therefore a hindrance, albeit a feeble one, to invasion. At dusk on March 5th, an American airplane sighted the smoke of a large fleet 200 miles due west of Cape Bojador. On approaching to reconnoiter more closely, it was chased and fired on by 3 machines marked with the Japanese cockade, and only escaped by its superior speed. The first shots of the war were thus fired in the clouds. A radio message from the air scout notified Admiral Ribley of the enemy's approach. Other American planes, which went up before dawn on the 6th, soon made contact with the Japanese fleet. At 5 a.m. it was observed west of Lingayen Bay, steering SSE. The 3 battlecruisers were in line ahead, with the light cruisers and destroyers screening them from submarine attack. Astern of the 3rd battlecruiser was the airplane carrier Hosho, several of whose chaser machines were flying ahead of the fleet. In view of the necessity of conserving all aircraft for defense purposes, the American pilots had been ordered to avoid action, and this they did, confining themselves to long-distance observation of the enemy's movements. Admiral Ribley by now had made his dispositions. At 8 a.m. he was 10 miles northwest of Lubang Island. His squadron was complete save for the Cleveland, this cruiser having been sent back to Cavite on account of engine trouble, which reduced her speed to 10 knots. 6 submarines, detached the previous evening, were now patrolling independently off the southwest coast of Luzon, with orders to attack the enemy's large ships if a good opportunity offered. The other 6 submarines were cruising between Subic Bay and Verde Island. A report came in from the air scouts at 9:15 that the Japanese fleet was firing heavily at some unseen target, probably a submarine. The thunder of the guns was clearly audible in the American ships, where the men waited with tense nerves for the first sight of their foe. 2 Japanese airplanes were now seen approaching at high speed, one of which dropped a bomb as it crossed the American ships. This missile struck the water some 200 yards astern of the flagship. Planes from the Curtis, which had been patrolling on the 8,000-foot level for the past hour, intercepted and shot down one of the enemy machines. At 10:20, smoke was visible from the control top of the Missoula, and a few minutes later, the dim shapes of the Japanese battlecruisers loomed on the horizon. Graphic accounts of the action that now took place have been published since the war by survivors of the American squadron. The following is an abridged version of the narrative by Lieutenant Elkins, who was present in the flagship Missoula as aide to Admiral Ribley. We were leading the line, if you could call that a line, which included but two ships, our own and the Frederick. The Galveston, Denver, and Curtis, being ships of no fighting power, were steaming 4,000 yards away on our port beam, where we thought they would be safe from overs, and yet near enough, as the Admiral grimly remarked, to pick us up if we go swimming. The destroyers were ahead of us in two groups, to port and starboard, where they were in a position to engage the Japanese torpedo craft if these should try to attack. At 10:30, the control top gave us the range as 24,000 yards. The Admiral and I were at this time standing on the after bridge. So clear was the atmosphere that the silhouettes of the Japanese ships were sharply defined, and with our glasses we could even see the big guns in the battle cruisers being trained. Our information was that their 14-inch had an extreme range of 23,000 yards, but this must have been an underestimate. For the first shots came when our instruments registered 24,000 yards, and they fell pretty close. As we were watching the leading ship, which we took to be the Congo, we saw a single flash from her forward turret. Some 45 seconds later, there was a roaring sound like an express train, and a giant spout rose from the sea about 600 yards to starboard. After this, the enemy was silent for a couple of minutes, during which we turned several points to port to keep the range open as much as possible, our destroyers meanwhile having put up a big smoke screen. At 10:45, the Congo let us have a 4-gun salvo, and a moment later the other two battle cruisers joined in. The air was full of noise as the huge 1,400-pounder projectiles roared overhead. They missed us clean, though the splash of one shell was close enough to wet the quarterdeck. We were just going into the conning tower when I turned to look back at the Frederick, and at that instant saw a sheet of flame burst from her side. She must have been hit amidships in the 6-inch battery by a high-explosive shell which detonated just inside the thin armor. As I watched, 2 more shells burst aboard her, both well forward, but I could not wait to see what damage had been done. We had not yet been hit, for the enemy seemed to be concentrating on the Frederick, which he may have mistaken for the flagship. The range was now 21,000 yards, far too long for our pop guns, but the strain of being under heavy fire without the ability to reply was so wearing that the Admiral gave orders for our after 10-inch turret to try a few shots, just to quieten the men, as he put it. Needless to say, the spotter reported all rounds short of the target, but it was certainly some relief to hear our guns going. We received our first hit at 10:53, a shell coming in obliquely a few feet from the bows, but well above the waterline, exploding with sufficient force to blow up a considerable stretch of the forecastle deck. A report now came from the top that the Frederick was in difficulties, with 2 funnels shot away and heavily on fire aft. Although still on an even keel, she was low in the water and must have been badly hit on or below her armor belt. Now as the enemy, with his far superior speed, could have closed the range and finished us off long before this had he so desired, it was evident that he was treating the affair as a long-range battle shoot to give his gunners practice. But this did not suit the Admiral's book. If we were not to perish ignominiously, without striking a single blow before we went, our only chance was to steam in until our guns would bear, taking the risk of getting smashed up while so doing. We accordingly turned to starboard and worked up to our full speed of 21 knots. Whether the unexpectedness of this maneuver took the enemy by surprise, or whether he thought he would let us rush on to destruction, I cannot tell. But it is certain that we got to within 15,000 yards of his line without being seriously hit. Both our turrets were now firing with the utmost rapidity, and even the 6-inch starboard battery joined in, though in their case it was probably wasted ammunition. We got at least one hit on the Congo, for I saw a big explosion at the base of her second funnel, and she seemed to sheer a little out of line. But this was as far as we were allowed to go. Thinking he had given us enough rope, the Japanese admiral must have decided to end the game without further ado. What followed is beyond description. All around us, the sea spouted and boiled. There were half a dozen terrific explosions in as many seconds. I heard one appalling crash as if a giant redwood tree had toppled athwart our deck. Then there was a blaze of light, another ear-splitting crash, and everything came to an end for me. When I recovered my senses, I was being dragged into a boat from the destroyer Hulbert. They told me the flagship had foundered at 11:30, having been practically blown to pieces. There were only 6 survivors besides myself. The admiral had gone down with the ship. Probably he had been killed by the shell that knocked me senseless. Someone must have dragged me out of the conning tower, but I never discovered who it was. From our boat, we could see the Japanese sweeping up the remnants of our squadron. Shortly before the flagship went down, the Frederick had blown up with all hands. We could see the Denver lying over on her beam ends, on fire from stem to stern. Nearby was the Galveston in action with Japanese light cruisers, which were absolutely pumping shell into her. Even as we watched, she put her bows deep under, the stern came up, and she took her last dive. About 4 miles ahead, a fierce fight was raging between 5 of our destroyers and thrice that number of enemy boats, but we could see little of the details. We heard afterwards that only 4 of the 13 destroyers and light mine layers that came out with us ever got back to Cavite. While watching this scene, we heard the drone of airplanes above us, and looking up saw 4 machines which someone in the boat said were ours. They were, in fact, torpedo planes from the Curtis, which ship, seeing herself about to be attacked by Japanese cruisers, had flown off all the planes then on deck. The Curtis was sunk by gunfire shortly afterwards, but meanwhile her planes were having a last try for the enemy. We could see them making straight for the Japanese battle cruisers, which were just visible from the boat. As we heard subsequently, 2 were shot down before reaching their objective. But one of the remaining machines got her torpedo fairly home on the Hiei, while the other, by great good luck, torpedoed and sank the scout cruiser Tatsuda. The Hiei, though seriously damaged, appears to have returned to Japan under her own steam. At 2:30 p.m., the Japanese destroyer Yanagi bore down on our boat and took us on board, whence we were transferred that evening to the battlecruiser Kirishima and treated with all proper courtesy. Such was the Battle of Lubang, as I saw it. Our squadron had been wiped out, and upwards of 2,500 gallant comrades had fallen, but at least we could say that we had upheld the honor of the flag. The only Japanese ships sunk were the Tatsuda and 2 destroyers. Their casualties throughout the fleet were returned as 600. But considering the enormous disparity between their force and ours, it was remarkable that they suffered any loss at all. During the action itself, none of the American submarines had found an opportunity to attack. But at 10 o'clock the same night, submarines S-18 and S-23, being then in company some 380 miles SSW of Subic Bay, observed several large ships steaming towards them and promptly dived to attack. These were the Japanese battle cruisers going north again at low speed on account of injuries to the Hiei. In spite of a strong destroyer screen, both submarines carried out their attack, firing 6 torpedoes in all. One of these struck the Kirishima, but so far forward that the damage was inconsiderable. 2 torpedoes from S-18 aimed at the Congo passed astern of her and hit the large destroyer Hamikaze, which sank in a few minutes. Although many depth charges were dropped, both submarines made good their escape. The destruction of Admiral Ribley's squadron left the way open for the invasion of the Philippines. Ere yet the last battered American ship had vanished from sight, a radio message from the Japanese commander-in-chief set in motion the fleet of transports which had been lying at Kure and other ports for some days past, with 100,000 fighting men on board. The whole convoy, with its naval and air escort, was underway at dusk on March 6th. Steaming south at a speed of 12 knots, it was time to reach the shores of Luzon in 4.5 days. And except for a few destroyers and submarines, the nearest American warships were at Hawaii, nearly 5,000 miles distant. The invading force outnumbered the American garrison in Luzon by at least 6-1. It had a proportionate superiority in artillery and other equipment, and there were the guns of half the Japanese fleet to cover its landing. In case of need, reinforcements in men and material could be rushed from Japan in 20-knot ships in the space of 3 days, or from the advanced base at Formosa in 36 hours. Everything, therefore, favored the Japanese enterprise. It has since been admitted that active preparations for the conquest of the Philippines had begun in the 3rd week of February, well in advance, that is, of the actual declaration of war. The Army Transport Section at Tokyo had on its books upwards of 100 vessels with a sea speed of 14 knots or more, all of which could be requisitioned by the government if required. But to do this would have caused a serious dislocation of the shipping industry, while the sudden withdrawal of all the fastest Japanese merchant ships from their ordinary routes must have inevitably aroused suspicion abroad and led to the inference that some great military undertaking was in view. It was accordingly decided not to use fast ships for the transport of the Philippine Expeditionary Force, but to employ instead the requisite number of slower vessels, with a collective speed of 12 knots. This, of course, entailed a longer passage, but calculating on the destruction of the United States Asiatic Squadron, and knowing that American reinforcements from the Eastern Pacific, in the unlikely event of their coming at all, could not arrive for several weeks, the Japanese military command was ready to accept the slight delay involved by the use of slower transports. The Expeditionary Force was composed of 5 divisions, with an approximate strength of 100,000 men. A Japanese division is usually made up of 2 brigades of infantry, 1 regiment each of cavalry and artillery, 1 battalion each of engineers and train, together with chemical warfare, gas, and motor machine gun sections. 4 tank regiments accompanied the expedition, with a total of 30 light Atsuta tanks, which could travel over level ground at 12 miles an hour. Large motor-propelled barges or pontoons were carried on board the transports for landing tanks and artillery. The heaviest guns were 8-inch howitzers and 14-centimeter high-velocity pieces for long-range bombardment. Besides the naval aircraft carrier Matsushima, which had been detailed to sail with the convoy and had a complement of 20 planes, 5 transports were loaded up with Army aircraft, the total number of planes at the disposal of the invaders being well over 180. While some of the larger vessels carried as many as 3,000 men, the average capacity of the transports was 2,000. As landings on a supposed hostile coast had been practiced year after year as a regular feature of Japanese Army maneuvers, this operation was one with which officers and men were perfectly familiar. All necessary equipment for such work, boats, barges, pontoons, and portable jetties, had been in readiness at the military depots for years. In the same way, the tactical problems of cooperation between an invading army and its supporting fleet had been thoroughly worked out long beforehand. In their wars with Russia in 1904-05 and with China 10 years earlier, the Japanese had shown remarkable skill in throwing large bodies of troops ashore with speed and safety. This time, of course, the landing was likely to be opposed, but as the American garrison was small and could have no foreknowledge of the exact place where the troops would be disembarked, the resistance was not expected to be of a very formidable nature. To the Japanese General Staff, the defenses of the Philippines were an open book. Every yard of the ground had been personally surveyed and mapped by Japanese officers. Not only was the site and armament of every existing battery known with exactitude, but every position where a new battery might be placed was clearly marked on the large-scale maps prepared at the Imperial Staff College in Tokyo. At no time had a landing been contemplated in the near vicinity of Manila. Strong batteries, equipped with 12-inch rifles on disappearing mounts, were in position on the island of Corregidor, while others crowned the headlands on either side of the 12-mile entrance to the bay. As these pieces could sweep the sea over a radius of many miles, it would have been madness to expose warships, let alone crowded transports, to their devastating fire. To silence them by naval bombardment was out of the question. Their massive concrete emplacements were shell-proof. Nothing short of a direct hit on the gun itself or its mounting would be effective. And as the piece showed above the parapet only for a few seconds at a time, it offered a hopeless target. Against bomb attack from the air, the batteries were protected by strong shields of steel. Nor were these guns the only peril that menaced hostile ships seeking to penetrate the bay. Lying across the entrance were several rows of mines, through which no channel could be swept so long as the batteries on the heights remained in American hands. At Subic Bay, some 40 miles up the coast, other batteries and minefields were in position, but this place, within which the old American naval station of Olongapo was situated, was also given a wide berth. With so many other landing places available, where no fixed defenses existed, the Japanese saw no reason for exposing their ships to the guns and mines of fortified harbors. The chief danger, they perceived, would come from the American aircraft, and as events were to prove, their information as to the number of these was at fault. According to the last report from Japanese agents, not more than 50 serviceable planes were in the islands at the end of February. But on the 25th of that month, a transport had arrived at Manila, bringing 30 machines of a new and powerful type. These, as we shall see, played a very important part in the defense of Luzon. The American military force did not exceed 17,000 all told. 8,000 of these were United States regulars, infantry, artillery, and engineers. 2,000 were Marines, and the remainder native troops, Philippine scouts, and militia. There were 10 field batteries of 4 guns each, 3 mountain batteries, and a dozen mobile 6-inch guns on Caterpillar mounts. The artillery establishment was completed by 6 8-inch guns on railway mounts, which could be sent at a good speed to any point along the line and fired direct from the rails. It was hoped by means of these guns to bring the enemy ships under heavy fire if they attempted to disembark troops along the northwest coast of the island, to which the railroad ran parallel. Finally, there were the surviving 4 destroyers and 12 submarines, whose officers and men, now under the orders of Captain Gurner of the Cleveland, were burning to avenge their fallen comrades of the cruiser squadron. When news of the disaster to Rear Admiral Ribley's command reached Manila the same evening, March 6, it was patent to everyone that an invasion was impending. The blow might fall at any moment, for nothing seemed more probable than that the transports of the invading army were already approaching the coast. Actually, as we know, their sailing from Kure had been deferred until news of the American squadron's destruction reached Japan. But of this fact the defenders were naturally ignorant. All that night, and throughout the days and nights that followed, aircraft and submarines maintained between them a sleepless watch over the northern approaches to Luzon. As there was no telling from which quarter the invaders would appear, the submarine flotilla was divided, 5 boats remaining on the west coast, 5 going to form a line of patrol east of Cape Ngafo, and the remaining 2, S-11 and S-15, being sent north to cruise in the Balintang Channel, through which the Japanese transports might be expected to pass on their way south.
This concludes today's reading of The Great Pacific War by Hector Bywater, presented by Major Intonio. Join us also tomorrow for the next chapter, or download the complete audiobook from our webshop at www.payhip.com/Antonio. Thank you for listening, and so long.